You've been active in politics since you were 13 years old in 1940. Is stealing votes a real problem or just a talking point for losing candidates?
Well, just to straighten out the record, uh, I was in show business for a lot of years. I started when I was 5 years old, and so I was a very precocious kid, which means that I was interested in world events and I was interested in politics long before the average kid. I guess I was a weird kid. And of course, we traveled a lot. And I was away from home quite a bit of the time, my hometown. But basically, I always went back to New York City. That was my hometown. That was the town I felt that I belonged to and the town I knew the most about. And so I was a New York City guy through and through. And I knew, so did everybody else in New York City know, that the Democrat machine in New York City was run by Tammany Hall. And everybody knew that Tammany Hall was one of the most corrupt organizations in the history of the world. And also that they had pretty much, most of the time at least, run New York City from before the Civil War. And so, to tell a New Yorker that there's no stolen votes, I mean, it would get you a good laugh in those days. And then if you cross the river, if you cross the Hudson River, you were in Jersey City. And the mayor of Jersey City, also known as the boss, Boss Haig, also known as I am the law Haig, who made it clear that he decided what went on in his town. Everybody in New Jersey knew that they stole votes in Jersey City. It was infamous, if you will. And, you could go any place in the United States and it was the same thing. I mean, you'd find cities everywhere. Kansas City, the Pendergast machine. They're the people that put Harry Truman in the Senate. And then later on, of course, he became vice president and then president of the United States. And of course, the most corrupt machine in the United States in those days was Chicago, especially when they had the Kelly Nash machine. And, if you ask anybody in Chicago, I was in and out of Chicago a lot. I was at a couple shows that were played there for a couple months. And so, instead of staying at a hotel, we stayed at a little apartment and, got to know the local people a little. But I also traveled in and out of there, changing trains and so on. And so I know a little bit about Chicago. But if you talk to anybody in Chicago about the fact that they had, stolen votes, everybody knew that. And there were jokes about it. In Chicago, during an off year when there is no election, they steal 50,000 votes just to keep it practice. Or my favorite was the two guys working for the Kelly machine were in a cemetery one night at midnight taking down names and data to register new voters. And one of them was standing in front of one of the stones for quite a while. And the other guy was very nervous about being in a graveyard at midnight. And he went back to him and he was really upset. He said, "Hey, come on, let's go. You've been standing in front. What are you doing?" The guy said, "Well, I'm having trouble." He said, "This guy's got a long Polish name and I just can't get the right spelling. I can't make out some of the letters." The guy said, "Well, forget about him. Let's go on to the next place." And the first guy said, "Wait a minute. We're part of the Democratic Party of Chicago. You don't lose your vote just because you're Polish." And of course, that's how everybody out there saw the situation. And I had some personal experiences. I lived at 375 Central Park West, up on the Upper West Side of New York. One of my neighbors in apartment 312, same floor as I lived in, Ralph and Jane lived there. He was a mafia soldier, and I knew them more than I knew most people, not just because they lived on the same floor, but because he was the local bookie. And I was a horse player. And so I dealt with him, if you want, in a business relationship besides being a neighbor. And one night I went over to see them about something, whatever. And Jane was sitting there and she had a pile of papers and she was filling them out. There was some kind of form that she was filling out. And she explained it to me at one point. Now, in those days, they were bringing up Puerto Ricans by the plane load in old converted DC-3s that had been bought as surplus from the military. And they were being brought up as labor for the garment industry and to vote for Congressman Vito Marcantonio, who was a fascinating guy who had one foot in the camp with the Communist Party, and he had the other foot in the camp with the mafia, which is an incredible combination. But in any case, Jane was sitting there and she was filling out these papers. And what she explained to me is that, yes, they had the right to vote because they were American citizens. There was no question about that. However, there was some kind of a form they had to fill out, and it had to be done in English. And a lot of them didn't speak English, so they were eligible to vote, but they didn't have the proper credentials to vote. And to make it possible for them to vote, they had to have those papers filled out. And Jane sat there filling one after the other. And she told me she was getting $1 a piece for all of the forms that she'd fill out. And, that gave me a little view of was there any skullduggery going on in voting. And then another one was that I was in Columbus, Ohio, the day, or maybe it was 2 or 3 days after Jack Kennedy won the election against Nixon. And the conference had to do with young people. I think they were all juniors and seniors in high school. Nice kids. And at one point, one of them came to me when I was alone, and he was a very nice black kid. And he told me he was ashamed of what had happened in his district, where he lived, in his neighborhood. And of course, I asked him, what was it? And he said, well, the local Democratic leader was going through the neighborhood, and he had a scroll of names, a scroll, not a notebook or something like that. He had a scroll of names, and he was going door to door, and he was handing out $5 bills and checking off names, and then going to the next apartment or the next building. And so, I'm pretty convinced that there's been a lot of votes stolen over the years, and I have no opinion really about what's going to happen in this election coming up, but I sure do know that a lot of votes have been stolen over the years in the United States. I'll give you one thing that was done to try to cut it down, not stop it, was when I ran for Congress. We knew, by the way, I'm rather proud to say that when I ran against an 8-term incumbent, and my party had never carried that district in its history, and I almost pulled it off. But one of the things we did to try to cut down on the number of votes that were stacked against us is we knew there were a couple cities that always ended up with more votes than they should. And what we did was we picked the 2 biggest guys we had among our volunteer staff. And we had them put on dark suits, white shirts, dark ties, then put on an overcoat and a hat. And they started out even before the polls opened. And they went from polling place to polling place in those 2 cities. And they would walk in, look around as if they were, smelled something bad and were checking up. And then they would nail the guy that was the head of the office, whoever, and they would say to him, we're keeping a special eye on polling places this year. We're really interested in cracking down on stolen votes. And if you see anything in the least bit suspicious, just give us a call, will you? And then they would write out a phone number on a card and hand it to him. And thank you and turn around and walk out. And, they never claimed that they were anybody doing anything for the government or whatever, but they left that impression, hopefully. And we may have saved some votes. We might have lost even bigger if it hadn't have been for that.